right, we're going to start. So I hope everybody grabbed some food while it was here. Yeah, so there's food outside if anybody needs it. And I'm glad to say we have our speakers here. Oops, it disconnected.
No, it just
No.
says security alert. I don't know how. We need
Can we go to escape? There. I'm technical enough.
There you go, fantastic.
No, I've been teaching here for a while. So I'm Dr. Ritz. Those of you who know me from the methods lectures know who I am. Otherwise, I have been formerly the chair of epidemiology, and I'm standing in today for the current chair who unfortunately couldn't be here. So I welcome all of you to this seminar of the epidemiology department that features our guest from England, who you've all hopefully met yesterday when he gave a talk already, and he is giving another one today, and we're all looking forward to it. So George Davey Smith, for those of you who haven't met him yesterday, I got to know him because of the word Mendelian Randomization, and that was quite a while ago. And I think George is still trying to advocate for this concept, and it's a good one. So. Yeah, exactly. There you go. Yeah, so if you want to learn that, please come on Friday. And for those of you who have genetics interest, but also the ones who don't, it's actually a really, really interesting method. And George also was the editor of IJE, the International Journal for Epidemiology, for a long time. So if you have submitted and got a letter, sorry, we are not interested, it's his fault. But of course, it's a huge job, so we all as a community actually owe to George for doing this for so long and doing it so competently. So thank you, George. But for now, we want to hear him talk about the Book of Why, which was actually written by Dr. Judea Pearl, who we have here in our room. And you may have read his books, and you may have even read this book. And you may remember that, you know, the famous concept of DAGs, directed acyclical graphs, was more or less brought on the scene by Judea and then picked up by our own Sander Greenland, who we see this afternoon debating with George as well. And so we have a whole day of one of our esteemed colleagues after another talking to us, so this will be fun. George said he cut his talk down to half an hour to give Judea some time, and then we will have a question and answer session. So we have the room until 1:30. So no hurry, and I hope you brought time. Thank you, George.
So thanks again for the invite to UCLA, and so yeah, if you see me skipping a few slides, it's because of the fire alarm, and I'm going to skip through a few things. But I'd just first like to ask, and you've got to not be influenced by the fact that Judea's here. I want to see who's got the Book of Why. So that's the majority of people. Now keep those hands up. Can you keep your hands up? Yeah, people are holding them up. They want to get them signed. Who has read any of it? Who has read it all the way through? Okay, so some hands have gone down. Okay, but this. So I've structured this around talking about the Book of Why, and from a perspective of an empirical researcher. I'd imagine some of you, maybe ones who haven't read the Book of Why, students might have also know the primer that Judea and colleagues wrote as well. So if you've read either of them, this is fine. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to talk about as I see it, the value of DAG theory to epidemiology. I'm going to say a bit about the reality of use of DAGs in epidemiology, some of which has come from my experience of having to read a very large number of papers as the editor of the International Journal of Epidemiology we were getting 1,000 papers a year by the time I was worn out. Well, Shah Ibrahim and I, two of us, co-edited it with a team, including Karen Michaels as well, so on the associate editor teams. I'm going to say something about Sewell Wright. Here I call it getting right wrong, so Judea can come back on his view of Sewell Wright. I'm going to talk about where background knowledge comes from and the consequences of believing the DAGs. And those of you who have read the Book of Why will know I think really useful framing of this at the beginning in terms of the ladder of causation, starting off with association in the statistics of Carl Pearson and correlation coefficients, with a debatable interpretation, his sort of denial of the concept of causality, for which there's quotes that can be made, although it's very clear that Pearson was making causal statements in a very large amount of his actually applied work. And my reading of the grammar of science is that Pearson denied that individual event causation was a meaningful concept. And it's clear that at the group levels, he made statements that were very clear that why would he, if you're a eugenicist, you obviously think you can do something through manipulations. So he certainly believed that in group level causation. Then, of course, R.A. Fisher at the second level of intervention, and with Fisher's development of randomized controlled trials, but I think importantly also, Fisher's very clear notion of causation in the development of the analysis of variance in 1918 and its application to partitioning genetic and environmental causation of traits, again at an aggregate level. And then at the top of the ladder, Judea, with the counterfactual reasoning, which then allows you to, which is a form of abstraction of what you've learned from the levels below, which allows transportability of what you've learned. And also you will have seen the this not really helpful diagram as well at the beginning of the sort of engine, if you like, of inference, with the key issue of background knowledge in the dotted box on the left, that you require the background knowledge which allows you to make quantifiable assumptions and build a model which allows you to have a recipe for answering the query at a model level, and then to actually generate estimates with actual data. And so they sort of inference engine. You'll have seen that. Now, what from my view are absolutely unequivocal gains to epidemiology from employing directed acyclic graphs. The first is the structure of biases. So, and here's an illustration of one such bias, which I think this really helps with the structure. So I'm going to, as I always do, I'm an empirical researcher. I can't think of things at an abstract level, really. I'm going to talk about a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine 15, 20 years ago, which purported to show that heavy alcohol consumption reduced the risk of stroke, which just seems implausible because we know alcohol increases blood pressure, which increases stroke, and also that it has some anticoagulant effects, which certainly increase hemorrhagic stroke. And we now know from other methods, such as Mendelian Randomization, that alcohol absolutely increases the risk of stroke rather substantially, as we know from recent Lancet paper from the Kadoorie China group, for example. So why did this study get the answer wrong? And the most likely reason is that the study was based on the American Cancer Society volunteer cohort. A tiny proportion of people who could have participated in this cohort actually did participate in the cohort. These are volunteers, and if you're a heavy alcohol user, you're less likely to volunteer, and if you're in poor health, you're less likely to volunteer. which, depending on how those two things act together, could lead to there becoming a sort of negative association in the volunteers between alcohol consumption and poor health, i.e. the heavy alcohol consumers would be less likely also to have poor health and maybe other characteristics which would increase the risk of stroke. Now that structure of bias, the idea that you automatically condition on an outcome variable when you have volunteer samples, now that was recognized before one could put them in these forms, at a time when I certainly was not using DAGs in 2004. We explained this here, but you explain it in words. It's firstly it's cumbersome explanation to explain it, but these words. You can go back and look at the paper, 2004 paper. We do explain it. I promise. We explain that, but not with it. But it is considerably easier with the diagram. I mean, interestingly, the first example that I know of, and also is referenced in the Book of Why, is Arthur Cecil Pigou's discussion. Again, interestingly, of alcohol. This was of heavy alcohol consumption and the quality of offspring. And Carl Pearson was suggesting from various secondary data analyses that heavy alcohol consumption of parents in the parents didn't actually adversely affect the offspring. And Pigou, when I say he's not the fourth man, it's because in Britain he's most famous for, he's not famous, but in the 1970s, after he was dead, it was thought that he was the fourth man who'd been one of the spies, but he wasn't the fourth. He wasn't the fourth man. And what he should be known for is Pigovian taxes, which are taxes on externalities. So, for example, a climate change tax, if it was introduced, would be it was Pigou's theories of Pigovian taxes. But so he explained it in words here. You find it very hard to get the Westminster Gazette of 1911, and this had been discussed once by Stephen Stigler in a chapter in a book. It's the only reference to it there was. The only person who'd referenced it, but this is we've reprinted it in the IJE. It's great being an editor because you could just say we'll reprint this when we wanted to. So that's an unequivocal gain from from employing DAGs. So you allow the structure of biases, and also you make them transportable, because it's not just alcohol and volunteering into studies, or alcohol and other qualities of the parents that Pigou was talking about by areas that Pigou was talking about. It's about there's a huge number of potential biases introduced into epidemiology by this sort of conditioning on outcome. So you make them transportable. The DAGs make them transportable and explicable, and that I think is an unequivocal gain. So Judea, in a piece he wrote a while ago, he's talking about why didn't economists pick up on path diagrams, and he said that his explanation was that the early econometricians were extremely careful mathematicians. They thought they could keep the mathematics in purely equational statistical form and just reason about structure in their heads. Indeed, they managed to do so surprisingly well because they were truly remarkable individuals and could do it in their heads. And the same is definitely the case of some of our heroes in epidemiology. Here's Brian McMahon in 1965. So who's heard of the smoking and birth weight paradox, the mortality paradox that basically, who's heard of it? A few people heard of it. So it's the paradox that if you're looking at your own mortality, all of us do, and you were born with low birth weight, as I actually was, then you actually want your mother to be a heavy smoker. Your mortality is actually better if your mother is a heavy smoker at a given level of birth weight, which seems counterintuitive, and some people used it to support. To say maternal smoking wasn't good, but I'm very thankful. My mother was a heavy smoker, not because that was good for me, but because it means that my low birth weight is less likely to portend bad things. And Brian McMahon, anyway, people said this was sort of solved later by through understanding the causal structures through causal diagrams. He said it in words, as there are many examples of such things being solved, because some of these people are clever and they can do it in their heads, but as most of us aren't, they can't do that. It's very useful to have, very, very useful to have them have DAGs for transportability. The second is providing an explicit rationale for constructing adjustment sets. You know, you read epidemiological papers, and often there's and just things that happen to correlate with your exposure of interest. Everything's adjusted for. So actually having to provide a rationale for that is good. You don't want to adjust for concomitant for outcome for variables which are influenced by the exposure and might be influenced by other things. At least you don't want to in your main analysis. You might want to do that in sensitivity analyses, etc. And related to that is that they lead to an explicit presentation of some of the assumptions the researcher holds. So if you're constructing a DAG, presenting a DAG, you actually have to make your assumptions clear. Some of those assumptions may be wrong, as I'll get onto, and it's good if they've been put into a diagram. And fourthly is the abstract DAGs. So thinking about the DAG for a particular study design or particular study situation really have been or can be helpful with methodological developments. A few of you, I think some people here, came. Did anyone come yesterday to the causal inference workshop? You did. People aren't admitting it. God, it was that bad. Oh, Jesus. Anyway, yesterday I talked about sibling studies and how actually trying to talk in words about the possible issues of a between sibling comparison, which we just sort of think, oh, that adjusts for lots of things we want to controls for a lot of things we want to control for. Can introduce substantial, can introduce problems as well. And again, waving one's hands about, one could talk about it without diagrams, or with schematics which weren't causal diagrams, but it's difficult. But so those things are unequivocal gains for epidemiology. The issues I have are, as I say, from the experience of being an editor, amongst other things, is the reality of the use of DAGs in the actually published epidemiology. So there are programs such as Johannes Texter's DAGity program. This now has approaching 700 citations. When writing a paper in 2016 with Nancy Krieger, it had only about 150 at that time, and I went through the papers that cited it and constructed DAGs. It was not a great experience. But the authors themselves are now doing a full systematic review. But in many cases, in lots of cases, one saw that even though the program was used to help people construct the DAGs, often it appeared without necessarily enough thought. What was actually done, the reality, this just happened to be the most recent citation when Nancy and I wrote the paper in which we discussed this, that you directed acyclic graphs and 10% change in estimate procedures. People, 10% change in estimate procedures are not ones I hope taught in UCLA as ways of variable selection. Were used to identify covariates for inclusion in multivariable models. And these included age, education, living with a partner, parity, one of which parity could be an outcome of breastfeeding, which was the exposure, etc. And this just is repeated over and over and over again. The actual reality of what's done is it doesn't show the benefits that one sees from the abstract use of the DAGs for thinking about biases and transportability, etc. And I won't go through this, especially in time I was going to, but again, when you actually look at any DAGs in papers, of course there's always many issues with every particular one, because you've got to remember that as important, or possibly more important in a way, than the actual arrows that are in a DAG are the arrows that aren't there. Or when you have nodes, vertices are not joined by arrows, you're making the assumption that there is no causal effect between those two things. So the absence of arrows is as important as the presence of arrows. Or an example which I think is a really interesting example, because it's one of the classic early sort of teaching examples from Maria Glymore's chapter on using causal diagrams to understand common problems in social epidemiology. So this is a teaching example, and so she's talking about looking at the effects of sort of education on diabetes, and she draws a diag where she thinks that family income during childhood will affect low education, which it will do, and the maternal mother's genetic diabetes risk will affect the fact the mother had diabetes. And of course, your mother's genetic diabetes risk influences your risk of diabetes, you being So if you're trying to look at the low education and diabetes, you shouldn't adjust for mother's had diabetes. And it's not just put as you'd want to think about it. This is didactically said. Under the graphical criteria, one should not include mother's diabetes status as a covariate. Straightforward. And I hear these things being just said back because people have learnt from these didactic approaches. The point is that a mother's glucose level during pregnancy may well affect cognitive development in utero. There's a whole raft of studies where that is the case, and of course it affects diabetes risk. So it's a straightforward confounder. And so this is the issue. You shouldn't adjust it. It's an M-bias collider, but it's also a potential confounder. But you get these rules, and we just saw these all the time in papers that were submitted. That people will say we didn't adjust for these factors, because of a structure like this. Well, Sander Greenland wrote a paper which I highly recommend people go back and read in 1993, when he actually discussed the likely magnitude of bias through not adjusting for confounders, through being worried about collider adjustment. But this is seen just repeatedly, both in the teaching and in what you actually get submitted, which is what my experience is based on. And now, and this is a fantastic paper. Highly recommended paper, if people haven't read it, by Peterson, Causal Models and Learning from Data. And there they say a structural causal model provides a tool for understanding whether background knowledge combined with the observed data is sufficient to allow a causal question to be translated into a statistical estimand, and if not, what additional data or assumptions are needed. And then, in many cases, rigorous application of a formal causal framework forces us to conclude that existing knowledge and data are insufficient to claim identifiability, in itself a useful contribution. And I very much agree with this, that this really would be a useful contribution. But again, my experience is I've not seen situations, I don't think there are situations where people actually do then not go ahead if they've got a study they're doing. They don't know of situations where people say, okay, we've looked at the assumptions that would be required to make this estimand sensible, and we won't do it. I've not seen that. I'd be interested to hear people's experience of having seen that. And what about the assumptions of causal DAGs and causal modelling approaches when you're actually looking at data, as opposed to thinking about abstract issues of bias and structure, etc. Well, there's obviously many assumptions, but two important ones are no measurement error. I mean, a remarkable thing. This is a very good chapter from probabilistic computational causal discovery for systems biology, using DAGs, applying it to settings which they call, and sadly reference me as they call it, Mendelian Randomization, but I don't think that's what they're doing, but that's what they call it. I suppose I don't have a patent. But what they say though is that no measurement error, the variables are measured without measurement error. This is a subtle assumption that is required to learn causal Bayesian networks, often not realized by practitioners who apply these techniques. So that's people in the field. Measurement error being a causal, being a subtle assumption. Again, how often did you actually see the DAGs which actually put measurement error in? Of course, you say you can put measurement error in, but when have you seen that done? And when have you seen people who move to the next stage and say that that means you can't do that estimation? Now, I don't know if were any people here yesterday for my talk, the postmodern epidemiology talk? So at that talk, you'll know that like in 1991, without the aid of any DAGs whatsoever, thinking about measurement error in the set of variables, I said that and published a paper in 1991 saying that the HDL cholesterol triglycerides question could not be answered with data. So firstly, you don't need, DAGs aren't required to make the Petersons, oh sorry, I've gone past it, to make that statement. It was done before. I had never heard of DAGs in 1991. But thinking about measurement error, published a paper saying this can't be analysed. I've seen very few examples of that which have followed on from DAG modelling. And yeah, there's no unmeasured confounding too. That's an assumption. You can't make estimates if there's unmeasured confounding. And the equation is that no measurement error plus no unmeasured confounding equals not epidemiological data, in my experience. So now on to, I think Judea and I agree about quite a lot of things. I think one thing we do agree about is the genius of Sewell Wright. But I'm going to say just a few things about Sewell Wright. It's very difficult not to like Sewell Wright. He wasn't a very sociable man, quiet, but a genius. But James Crow's National Academy of Sciences biographical memoir of him says he read his father's math books and learnt to extract cube roots before entering school, a skill that he said brought him instant, lasting popularity with the other students. Now, I think that's something that probably some other people here can equate with that. And this is a review of the Book of Why, but picking up, I think, things which I hinted at in the Book of Why, I said in the Book of Why, which is Wright's work was vigorously and explicitly discouraged by the 1,000-pound gorillas of Pearson and Fisher, which isn't, Pearson never commented on Wright's path diagrams at all, and nor did Fisher, but not only did Fisher not comment on them, Fisher and Wright came to precisely the same analysis of variance. Fisher in 1918, in a paper which Wright was certainly ignorant of in his paper a couple of years later, Wright certainly came absolutely independently to this, but Wright came to it with his path diagrams. Fisher did it with no diagrams at all. And they came to the same model. I think Sewell Wright is a genius, but Wright is the one who made a mistake with his diagrams. With his path diagrams, Wright still made the mistake on dominance, and thinking not formalising the fact that parent, offspring, and sibling, offspring, quantitative associations will be different because siblings can share dominance. So anyway, now. And in the Book of Why, Judea, talking about Wright's work, says that a rebuttal published in 1921 by one Henry Niles, a student of American statistician Raymond Pearl, no relation, who in turn was a student of Carl Pearson, the godfather of statistics. So the suggestion here is that Niles, Niles sort of squashing, it's a pathetic paper actually, Niles' paper, but Niles has attempted rubbishing of Wright was due to Pearl, and Pearl's being a student of Carl Pearson. I'm fortunate enough to be a member of the National Academy of Medicine, which is for the docs attached to the National Academy of Sciences, so I know the process of how things used to get published in PNAS. And if you look at the paper that Judea discusses by Wright, what you notice is it was communicated by Raymond Pearl. It is impossible that Pearl had anything but the highest admiration for a paper that he communicates. I'll tell you, you do not communicate a paper at the National Academy of Sciences by someone who you want to squash or someone whose work you don't agree with. Anyway, and I'm going to skip this. I'd love to talk to Judea about Barbara Burke's. It's a really very interesting story, but I have disagreements with how it's presented. I bought my 1945, the booklet posthumously published she wrote on heredity to share. Anyway, And then this is from Judea, talking about a prominent SEM researcher once asked me, under what conditions can we give causal interpretation to identify structural coefficients? I thought this colleague was joking. As a faithful reader of Wright and Havelmo, I had come to believe that the answer is simply always. Well, I think that would not be Sewell Wright's answer. So, because Wright developed path analysis in this context of genetic analysis, when you have the causal anchoring either of known crossed matings, then now you also can have the causal anchoring of measured molecular variants. I mean, he says this is Wright writing in a genetical structure of populations in 1949. The rate of decrease of heterozygosis in systems of mating more complicated than self-fertilization was first worked out from the recurrence relation between successive generations independently by Jennings and Fish for the system matings and by Jennings for some others. The present writer, I write, who had assisted Fish in his calculations, found a simpler way of finding this quantity, the method of path coefficients, based on the correlation between uniting gametes. So sadly, the notes that Wright took, according to the biography of him, the notes he took when he was doing this work for Fish aren't available, but he clearly developed path analysis in precisely systems of mating cases. And of course, you know, the famous picture are crosses. You know, so you have genetic anchoring of what he says, and he says this so often. I've only shown a few of them because there's too many of them to show, but it was of course realised that the concrete phenomenal actuality of the results was not proved by the analysis by path coefficients. It was absolutely explicit that path coefficient analysis just produced you standardised regression coefficients, as we call them now, which were just about associations. This rests on the validity of the premises, i.e. on the evidence for Mendelian heredity. The paper began with a quotation from Easton Jones on the universality of Mendelian inheritance under sexual reproduction as the justification for the analysis. Or a couple more cases. The hypothesis that heredity is Mendelian may usually be used safely as information external to a system of correlations among relatives. This is the background knowledge. External information of the most precise sort is provided by the pedigree and the practical universality of Mendelian heredity. Virtually all of Wright's path analyses were genetic. In the papers where he reviewed path analysis, he included, I think, 3 or 4 non-genetic examples, but there were ones when you had you had things that you might think, you know, were biological, very strongly biological knowledge. And interestingly, in what is the most, if you're interested in Wright and his development, probably the best place to start is the exchange, but the long exchange in 2 papers by Wright and by John Tukey in 1954 in the Statistics and Mathematics and Biology, a compilation. And interestingly, Tukey, by the way, thought of the 3-step ladder of causation. He talked about 3 steps on the ladder, from description to tangential, which was local causation, as it were. And then to functional, which was when you could extend beyond that. And Tukey also pointed out that one of Wright's very few non-genetic path analyses, when he was looking at birth weight, this is in guinea pigs, and litter size and gestational age, that Tukey actually drew a path diagram showing potential collider. There was potential collider in that situation. Actually, he didn't draw the path analysis. He drew a path of what he was talking about, but he then in the text describes that as a reason why you might not trust the findings. So Wright's path analyses were almost entirely based on you having genetic anchors. And in a paper which I disagree with quite a lot of, but it's a fun paper to read. Gutman's What is Not What in Statistics. He says path analysis does not analyse non-genetic paths, but I love this. Genetics has but one modest framework for paths. In contrast, according to current journals, sociologists keep discovering new fundamental path frameworks every month, and sociological graduate students are required routinely to hand in as individual class exercises new discoveries equaling Gregor Mendel's. So, so it was recognised a long time ago that this entirely depended on the Mendelian on Mendelian heredity. And here's a letter from Egon Pearson to Jerzy Neyman. I'm sure all of you will know of the Neyman-Pearson lemma in inference, but of course, thought to be not in the usual way we'll think of it as, certainly not so we think of as Bayesian. But it says, Pearson's writing, however, by 1929 I'd come down firmly to agree with Fisher that prior distributions should not be used except in cases where they were based on real knowledge, e.g. in some Mendelian problems. So, Wright, Neyman, Pearson, Fisher even would agree that in those situations you very clearly have some foundational knowledge to base things on. So for the inference engine, where does the background knowledge come from? Now, even though this is said to be, so the knowledge is said to be qualitative. In fact, it's explicitly been said, for example, in this paper, Judea says that the background knowledge is a set of qualitative causal assumptions that investigators are prepared to defend on scientific grounds. But our aim in causal inference is, of course, to produce knowledge that we can then move forward with. And you've got to remember that DAGs are recursive graphs, i.e., the output of, there are graphs where the output of one can become the input of one at a high level. They're recursive systems. And here from Causal Diagrams from 1995 paper, which I very highly recommended. As is often the case, I'm sort of obsessive, I tend to go back to early papers, but as is often the case, you always learn things from going back to the sort of early papers when things are being actually spelt out. So highly recommended paper and under discussion with it. So the basic limitation of the methods proposed in this paper is that the results must rest on the causal assumptions shown in the graph, and that these cannot usually be tested in observational studies. So I agree with this. In related papers, we show that some of the assumptions, most notably those associated with instrumental variables, see Fig 5b, are subject to falsification tests, which I entirely agree with. And here we said, talking at Sander Greenland, Sander and I won't be debating because I think we agree largely, but I've got a few things to say to make him cross, but only to make it more entertaining. But this is Sander's paper, again, recommended. Tyranny of null hypotheses is that as with regression models, causal models in observational health and social science are always false. So all our causal models are false, because there's always something you could think of to go in it. But the question is, are they false to the degree where you're going to get the wrong answer or the wrong inference? Because we can never know we have a correct model, and in fact, OHSS, we can't even know if we are very close. To say G is causal if unconfounded is a scientifically vacuous definition. It's saying that the graph is causal if the causal model it represents is correct. And in the Book of Why, there's a sort of statement that there isn't circularity in its reasoning, and I don't think this is a fatal flaw, but I think there is circularity, and that if that is acknowledged, it's actually more useful for health scientists trying to use DAGs. There's a sense that there's a causal revolution. I was at University College London in the very early 1980s, and the one book there was 3 copies on of. I nicked one of them. Phone up. You can sell me out to the police. But anyway, this is the one I nicked. And that's how I learned about path diagrams in the early 1980s was Asher's causal modelling. And in fact, path diagrams are tried in epidemiology. I went back and flicked through the International Journal of Epidemiology, and there was a rise and fall. So as they sort of entered sociology from the 1960s on, there's cases in the 50s, but as they took off, if you like, they were tried in epidemiology, and I think they went away. They definitely abated, because I think people found that without the causal anchors, they weren't producing what one wanted. And now I'm now going to get onto the issue, the one issue I know that Judea and I quite strongly disagree with, and this is about the position of randomized controlled trials. So consequences of believing the DAGs, my last section, you'll be very pleased to hear. So Judea introduced the front door criteria, which I think is very clever notion. As he says, this model, David Friedman and others said years ago, this is unlikely to be veridical. I've spent a lot of time trying to think of an example in the work I do where the front door would be useful, could work, and I think it's very clever, but I haven't come up with one. And there are it has to be said, very limited examples of front door criteria being applied and demonstrating effects that one believes. But in the Book of Why, Judea says that RCTs are considered the gold standard of causal effect estimation for exactly the same reason. Because front door estimates do the same thing with the additional virtue of observing people's behaviour in their own natural habitat instead of a laboratory, I would not be surprised that this method eventually becomes a serious competitor to randomised controlled trials. So that's the method for which there are currently no robust demonstrations, even in proof of principle settings, of it working, or in the Turing Award winner's speech saying the most significant practical impact of the causal revolution would probably be a continuous erosion of the supremacy of randomised clinical trials in the development and evaluation of drugs, therapeutical procedures, and social and educational policies. And this is something that I find concerning. So I would say, under the 21st Century Cures Act, the Food and Drug Administration is tasked with developing a programme to evaluate the use of real-world evidence to support approval of new indications for approved drugs or to satisfy post-approval study requirements. Real-world evidence can be defined as the clinical evidence regarding the usage and potential benefits or risks of medical products derived from analysis of real-world data. A framework for this programme will be published by the end of 2018. I don't think it's appeared yet. But the issue is, as I'm sure people here know much better than me because I'm not from the US, is there's a huge push at deregulation. The Trump administration is appointing ex-marketing guys from medical devices into serious regulatory positions. And the absolutely last thing I think we would want to do as health scientists is in any way think that's acceptable. So this is probably the only serious point. Well, a few things are serious, I think, but I really think that anything which feeds into the notion that you can get cheap real-world evidence which nicely won't find out detrimental effects of metal-on-metal hips. I've got hip replacements, so I'm concerned about that. Mine aren't metal, thank God. But anyway, metal-on-metal hips, we don't want that, in my view. And this is in that paper I was recommending from 1995. Judea, Paul Rosenbaum was one of the commentators. And Judea says, Rosenbaum mistakenly perceives path analysis as a competitor to randomised experiments. I agree with the 1995 version. I was going to skip this because I've been going on more than half an hour. This is just Guido Imbens asking for some real-world examples, which is what I would like to see. But there's many others. Well, this is Judea commenting on well-known people, Deaton and Cartwright, for example, writing critiques of randomised controlled trials, which I think it would be damaging. I think sometimes there's statements made which make it sound as though this framework can do more than it possibly can do. This is from the primer. It proves the enormous, even revelatory power that causal graphs have, not in merely representing, but actually discovering causal information. So that's unambiguous. That's saying that the graph is the causal graphs can discover causal information. Something which I think is not the case, except there's possibilities of doing doing such analyses when you've got very clear anchors like genes, but only in any case as something as follow-up. So on language, this is Levine writing in Epidemiology in 2009. She says, George Orwell wrote that language could be used to give the appearance of solidity to pure wind. It is disturbing that the language of causal modelling has been used to bestow the solidity of the complex process of causal inference upon mere statistical analysis of observational data. I think I agree with the Levine 2009 in terms of the language, even though it's repeatedly stated that these are causal models if your assumptions hold, that gets lost, and as we saw, sometimes statements are made which go beyond that. So I have to give my conflict of interest. I'm going to hand over to Judea, but my conflict of interest is that I'm old and time expired. This is a letter Judea wrote in response to one of our papers. She says that Nancy and I raised several objections to this, and that he speculates that that we're upset by the dazzling speed with which epidemiology has modernised its tools, which lies behind the author's discomfort, and that will subside as soon as researchers gain greater familiarity with the capabilities and flexibilities of the new tools. And just to say that I said this is my conflict of interest, and I accepted it because the published version of my talk yesterday, this is the beginning of the last paragraph, citing Judea. I say, as has been suggested, the reviews I express here may well reflect the last spasms emitted by a redundant and diminishing group refusing to recognise its superfluousness. Thank you.
Great. You raised here many points. First, I'm honored to be given the chance to participate in this discussion. As they say in the Mishnah, let other people evaluate your work, not you. And we have exchanged a few Twitters in the past. So that is great. Actually, what I've learned from George is that there is a causal revolution. It did take place. It had an enormous impact on what we are doing in our classroom, in our laboratory. And George's criticism is not really diminishing the impact of the causal resolution, but a quest to participate in it. So I really appreciate, because I was coming here with the idea, with curiosity, to find out what an experimental epidemiologist, how he or she views the causal revolution, whether it is any different than what you and I understand in it, or what you are taught in your classes, and I found out it's not. It's just the same principles that we abide with, and these principles did not exist prior to a few decades ago. I do not take credit for the revolution, and I said it very clearly in my book, that the revolution took place gradually, and many players took part in that, not the least of which are Jamie Robbins and Sander Greenland in your department, of course, and in others, in economics, although economics is a problematic case. Yeah. Because of reasons that we can discuss later. I see Ed here is smiling. Good. So it's really, we are all agreeing on the same principle. What are the principles? Let me summarize it in one sentence. Very simple principles. We have now a mathematical language for expressing what you know, what you wish to know, and what kind of data you have at your disposal. That's it. The rest is just details. Details that you might argue, you might quibble whether right meant that or meant something else. But basically, what we did not have 3 decades ago and what we have now is a mathematical language to express what you know, maybe your assumptions, some call it the physics, some call it the science, okay? But to express it mathematically. Second, to express mathematically what you wish to know. That's the hardest thing, by the way. If you've been an editor of a journal, you know that out of the 1,000 papers that you get, only maybe 3% explicates and confess what they really want to, what the research question is. We have now a mathematical language of expressing that. That's beautiful, using counterfactual. And the third one is the type of data we have at our disposal, whether it is experimental, or whether it has selection bias, or whatever we reservations we have about the quality of data, whether there are some missing data, right? We can express it now in a mathematical language and deliver these three components to an engine. I call it an inference agent. Engine on the wall, tell us what we can do and what we can do. The answers, of course, should not be misused. No one should say that the answer you got is the truth and nothing but the truth. The answers are always contingent upon the veracity of your assumption. But this is a great exercise. You come up, you admit ahead of time, dear policymaker, I cannot deliver to you what you want, but I can tell you categorically and logically, indisputably, that if you buy these assumptions, then you ought to buy those conclusions. And this is a kind of contingent delivery, it should be guiding everything we do.